If you're here to discover what Sumerian tablets actually say about the Anunnaki creating humans through genetic manipulation for mining labour, you're in the right place. This is exactly that investigation. Before we begin, drop a comment below telling us where in the world you're listening from and what time it is where you are. It helps us understand this global community exploring ancient mysteries together. In the climate-controlled vault beneath the British Museum in London, resting in archival housing marked with the catalogue number BM78941, lies a clay tablet that presents a problem for conventional history. The object itself is unremarkable at first glance. Reddish-brown baked clay, roughly the size of a paperback book, its surface covered in the characteristic wedge shaped impressions of cuneiform script. The tablet is damaged, its lower left corner missing, the surface worn in places where ancient fingers once pressed the stylus into soft clay more than 3,000 years ago. But it is not the tablet's appearance that troubles scholars. It is what the tablet says. BM78941 contains a portion of the Atra-Hasis epic, an Akkadian text that describes, in procedural detail, how the Anunnaki gods created human beings to perform labour that the gods themselves no longer wished to do. The text does not present this as allegory or poetic metaphor. It describes a crisis, a council, a deliberation, and a biological solution. It names the participants. It specifies the materials. It outlines the process with a precision that reads less like mythology and more like documentation. The tablet describes how lesser gods, called the Igigi, had laboured for 40 years, digging canals, dredging rivers, excavating earth. It describes their exhaustion, their rebellion, their refusal to continue. It describes a meeting of the senior Anunnaki to address this labour shortage, and then it describes what they decided to do about it. They would create a new being, a creature that could do the work. The text is specific about the method. They would take the essence of a god, described as blood and flesh, and combine it with clay from the earth. The mother goddess Nintu would shape this mixture. 7 males and 7 females would be formed. These beings would be designed to bear the workload, to carry baskets, to dig, to build, to mine. This is where the tablet becomes difficult to categorize, because the language it uses does not sound like the language of myth. It sounds like the language of procedure. When you stand in the British Museum's Mesopotamian galleries and look at the thousands of cuneiform tablets arranged in glass cases, you are looking at an administrative civilization. Receipts for grain, inventories of livestock, records of astronomical observations, legal contracts, medical prescriptions. The Sumerians and their successors recorded everything with meticulous precision. They were accountants of reality. Their language was the language of measurement, specification, documentation. So when a text from this same civilization describes the creation of humans using the same procedural tone employed for brewing beer or performing surgery, questions arise. Questions that conventional archaeology prefers to avoid. Questions about what these texts actually preserve. The standard interpretation is that BM 78941 and texts like it represent religious mythology, symbolic narratives meant to explain human origins through the lens of divine action. Humanity's subordinate position in the cosmic order is expressed through metaphor. The gods create humans from clay because clay is the earth, and humans work the earth. The divine blood represents the sacred nature of human life. The labour represents humanity's role in maintaining civilization. This interpretation is reasonable, scholarly, safe. It fits within established frameworks of comparative mythology. It aligns with how we understand other ancient creation narratives. It requires no revision of our understanding of human history. But it does not explain everything. It does not explain why multiple texts, composed in different cities across centuries, describe the same process with the same procedural details. It does not explain why the texts specify that earlier attempts produced defective beings before the successful model was achieved. It does not explain why one text, the Adapa legend, describes a human given exceptional intelligence by Enki but deliberately denied immortality, as though traits were selectable rather than inherent. It does not explain why the texts consistently describe the purpose of human creation as labour relief, not worship, not companionship, not cosmic balance. Labour, physical work, mining, digging, building, carrying. And it does not explain why these texts come from the world's oldest civilization, a people who appeared in southern Mesopotamia with a fully formed written language, complex mathematics, legal codes, astronomical knowledge, medical procedures, and architectural capabilities that would not be matched for millennia. What if we are reading these tablets incorrectly? Not incorrectly in translation, the cuneiform has been reliably deciphered, but incorrectly in interpretation. What if the Sumerians were not creating mythology to explain the world? What if they were recording history as they understood it? What if these tablets preserve the memory, however distorted by time, of an actual event? An event in which beings called the Anunnaki, whether gods, advanced humans, or something else entirely, deliberately engineered a new form of human through biological manipulation for the purpose of labour? This possibility sounds like science fiction. It contradicts everything we believe about human origins, about the timeline of our development, about our evolutionary path from earlier hominids to modern humans. It suggests an intervention, a design, an engineering project. But here is what cannot be ignored. The tablets exist. The texts say what they say, and the procedural precision with which they describe this creation process is consistent across independent sources, separated by geography and centuries. This is not a story about ancient aliens. This is an investigation into what the Sumerian texts actually preserve, what they describe, what they claim. We will examine the evidence as archaeological fact. We will present mainstream academic interpretations fairly. We will explore alternative possibilities without claiming certainty. And we will let you, the listener, draw your own conclusions about what these ancient records might mean. Because somewhere in the gap between mythology and history, between symbol and procedure, between metaphor and documentation, lies a question that refuses to resolve. A question inscribed on thousands of clay tablets, preserved in museums across the world, waiting for anyone willing to ask it. What if the Sumerians meant exactly what they wrote? Before the first city, the Tigris and Euphrates rivers flow through a landscape that witnessed the birth of civilization. This is not poetic language. This is archaeological consensus. In the region the Greeks would later call Mesopotamia, meaning between rivers, human beings first developed cities, writing, codified law, complex mathematics, institutional religion, standing armies, and bureaucratic government. Everything we recognise as civilization begins here, in what is now southern Iraq, in the late 4th millennium before the Common Era. But begins is perhaps the wrong word, because the Sumerians did not gradually develop these capabilities. They appeared with them. The archaeological record shows scattered Neolithic settlements across Mesopotamia dating back to the 7th millennium BC. These were farming villages, mud brick houses, domesticated animals, cultivated grain. By around 5000 BC, these settlements had grown into larger towns with irrigation systems and pottery industries. The Ubaid period, archaeologists call it, a slow development toward complexity. And then, around 3500 BC, something changes. Cities appear, not villages that slowly grew, but planned urban centres. Uruk, in southern Mesopotamia, explodes from a town into a metropolis, covering 2.5 square miles, with a population exceeding 50,000 people. This is not gradual development. This is a revolution. Within a few centuries, Uruk has monumental architecture, including the great temple complex at Tiana, massive ziggurats that required organisational capabilities we barely understand, and most significantly, a fully developed writing system. Cuneiform appears fully formed, not as pictographs gradually becoming abstract, not as simple tallies evolving into complex script. The earliest tablets from Uruk already contain a sophisticated writing system capable of recording not just quantities, but abstract concepts, verbs, proper names, grammatical relationships. Within a few generations, this script is being used to record everything from beer rations to love poetry. The standard explanation is that the pressures of urban life, administration, trade, religious ritual, necessitated record keeping, and writing emerged to meet this need. This is logical, but it does not explain the completeness of the system at its earliest appearance, nor the speed with which it spread to other cities. Alongside writing came mathematics. The Sumerians employed a sexagesimal number system, base 60, which we still use for measuring time and angles. They understood place value centuries before other civilizations. They calculated the area of irregular fields, the volume of granaries, the movement of celestial bodies. Clay tablets from the Old Babylonian period, around 1800 BC, demonstrate knowledge of the Pythagorean theorem 1,000 years before Pythagoras. They had law codes. The reforms of Uruk-agina in the 24th century BC describe legal concepts including protection of widows and orphans, regulation of temple officials, prohibition of unjust seizure of property. These are not simple tribal customs. These are articulated legal principles. They had medicine, cuneiform tablets, catalogue hundreds of pharmaceutical recipes, surgical procedures, diagnostic methods. One tablet from Nippur, dated to around 2000 BCE, is the oldest known medical handbook, prescribing treatments using plant, animal, and mineral substances combined in specific proportions. They had astronomy. Records from the 2nd millennium BCE document observations of Venus, predictions of eclipses, calculations of planetary cycles. The Molder-Apin tablets, dating to around 1000 BC but preserving much earlier material, contain a complete astronomical compendium including star catalogues, rising times, and a mathematical scheme for predicting lunar visibility. All of this the Sumerians developed, or more precisely, all of this the Sumerians had. Because the texts themselves suggest something different than invention. They suggest inheritance. The Sumerian king list, most completely preserved on the Weld Blundell Prism catalogue, number AN 1923.444 in the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford, begins with a remarkable statement. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu, not after humans invented kingship. After it descended. The text then proceeds to list kings who ruled before a great flood, with reign lengths that defy human lifespan. Alulim of Eridu ruled for 28,800 years. Al-Algar ruled for 36,000 years, 8 kings total, their combined reigns spanning 241,200 years. Mainstream scholarship treats these numbers as mythological, inflated for theological purposes, or based on a different calendrical system. But the text treats them as historical record, using the same formulaic structure employed for later, verifiable kings. The king list does not distinguish between pre-flood and post-flood rulers in terms of genre. It presents them all as history, and it claims kingship came from somewhere else, that it was given, not developed, that Sumerian civilization itself was not human innovation, but transmission. This theme repeats throughout Sumerian literature. In the myth of Inanna and Enki, the goddess Inanna travels to Eridu and receives from Enki the Mez, divine powers or principles that include kingship, priesthood, truth, descent into the underworld, the art of lovemaking, the art of war. These are not attributes humanity developed. They are packages of knowledge transferred from the gods to humans. The Barton cylinder, CBS 8383, in the Penn Museum, is among the oldest Sumerian creation texts, dated to around 2500 BCE. Though fragmentary, it describes the establishment of cities and the appointment of kings by divine decree. The gods decide how civilization will be organized. They implement it. Humanity receives it complete. None of this proves the Sumerian belief that their civilization was given to them by the Anunnaki, but it demonstrates that the Sumerians themselves consistently claimed this. They did not credit human ingenuity or gradual development. They credited divine instruction, knowledge transferred from those who already possessed it. In Eridu, the southernmost of the great Sumerian cities, archaeologists excavated a sequence of temple structures spanning from the Ubaid period through the early dynastic period. The earliest temple, dating to around 5000 BCE, is already sophisticated, already oriented, already built on a platform. 17 successive temples were built on this same site, each incorporating the ruins of the previous structure, maintaining precise orientation and expanding the complex. This continuity suggests not experimentation, but execution of a plan maintained across millennia. Eridu was considered the oldest city, the first place where kingship descended. It was the cult centre of Enki, the god of wisdom, fresh water, and creation. And according to the texts, it was in Eridu that Enki performed the creation of humanity. The Eridu Genesis, preserved on tablet CBS 1673 at the Penn Museum, describes the creation of humans, the establishment of kingship in 5 cities, and the coming of a great flood. Though the tablet is damaged and large portions are missing, what survives presents human origins as a deliberate act performed in a specific place for a specific purpose. The gods create humans, they establish cities, they appoint kings. The text treats this as chronological sequence, as history unfolding. If we take the Sumerians at their word, a radical proposal for modern scholarship, then their civilization did not slowly evolve from Neolithic villages. It was established, fully formed, by beings they called the Anunnaki. These beings provided the knowledge, the organizational structures, the technologies that allowed cities to function. And at some point, these beings decided they needed a labor force to perform physical work. The question this raises is not whether we believe in gods. The question is what event or series of events caused the Sumerians to consistently describe their origins in these terms. What were they trying to preserve? What memory, however mythologized, underlies this claim? Because if the Sumerians were simply creating origin myths like every other culture, we would expect more variation, more evolution of the story, more difference between city-states and time periods. Instead, we find remarkable consistency, the same gods, the same sequence, the same claim: we were created by the Anunnaki to perform their labour. This claim is found not just in obvious mythological texts, but woven throughout administrative records, king lists, temple hymns, wisdom literature. It is treated as background fact, as history so established it needs no defence. The Sumerians wrote about the Anunnaki creating humans the way they wrote about the sun rising, as something everyone knew, as something that simply was. When archaeologists first excavated Sumerian sites in the mid-19th century, they expected to find the crude remains of early humans stumbling towards civilization. Instead, they found mathematical tablets calculating cube roots. They found surgical bronze instruments of such precision they resemble modern tools. They found architectural plans for buildings requiring sophisticated engineering. They found cuneiform tablets containing such complexity of thought and expression that it took decades to even decipher them. The Sumerians appeared in southern Mesopotamia with capabilities that should have taken millennia to develop. And they themselves claimed they did not develop these capabilities. They claimed they were taught. by whom is the question tablet BM 78941 attempts to answer? The language of the gods. To understand what the tablets say, we must understand how we know what they say. Cuneiform was a lost language, buried beneath Mesopotamian tells, unreadable for 2,000 years. The wedge-shaped impressions pressed into clay tablets were recognized as writing in the early 19th century, but recognizing writing and reading it are different accomplishments entirely. The breakthrough came through persistence and polyglot inscriptions, particularly the Behistun inscription in western Iran. Carved into a cliff face at the command of Persian King Darius I around 520 BCE, the inscription proclaimed his victories in 3 languages: Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian. British Army officer Henry Rawlinson, in one of archaeology's more dramatic moments, dangled from ropes on the cliff face to copy the inscription, working section by section over the course of several years in the 1830s and 1840s. Old Persian, being the simplest script and related to known languages, was deciphered first. This provided the key to the Babylonian version, and from Babylonian, scholars worked backward to Sumerian, the earlier language that Babylonian cuneiform had adapted for Akkadian speech. By the 1850s, multiple scholars could independently translate Akkadian texts and produce similar results. Cuneiform was readable. This achievement cannot be overstated. An entire civilization's written record, tens of thousands of tablets, became accessible. Everything the Sumerians, Akkadians, Babylonians, and Assyrians recorded was now recoverable. Their laws, their business transactions, their letters, their poetry, their mythology, their scientific observations, their medical practices, their prayers, all of it preserved in clay that survives when paper crumbles and stone erodes. But readability does not equal interpretability. We can sound out the words, we can identify the grammar, but understanding what the texts mean requires grappling with conceptual frameworks profoundly different from our own. Take the word Anunnaki itself. The term appears throughout Sumerian and Akkadian literature, but its precise meaning is contested. The most common translation is those of royal blood or princely offspring, derived from Sumerian An-7, Unna, and Ki. They are described as children of An, the sky god, or more broadly as the senior gods who decree fate. In Sumerian texts, the Anunnaki are often contrasted with the Igigi, a group of lesser deities. The relationship between these groups varies across texts. In some, the Igigi are younger gods who serve the Anunnaki. In the Atra-Hasis epic, the Igigi are the labourers who rebel against work, prompting the creation of humans as replacements. The hierarchy is clear. Anunnaki are the decision-makers, Igigi are the workers, and humans are created to become the workers in place of the Igigi. But whether these are theological categories or preserve some other distinction is the interpretive question. Modern scholarship reads Anunnaki as mythological beings, divine entities in the Sumerian religious worldview. This is the default position, and nothing in the tablets explicitly contradicts it. The texts call them gods. They perform miracles. They are immortal. They possess powers humans lack. Reading them as anything other than deities requires importing assumptions the texts themselves do not make. However, the texts describe the Anunnaki in curiously physical terms. They eat and drink. They grow tired. They become angry, fearful, lustful. They make mistakes and correct them. They deliberate in councils and disagree with each other. They use tools and perform procedures. The mother goddess Nintu, in the creation of humans, is described as needing specific materials, mixing them in specific ways, gestating the mixture, and producing 7 males and 7 females in what reads like a production process. The language used for divine action often parallels the language used for human action. When the texts describe Enki creating humanity, they use the same verbs used for a potter shaping a vessel or a smith forging a blade. This could be anthropomorphic projection, humans describing gods in human terms, because we have no other terms. Or it could reflect something about how these events actually occurred. Translation presents its own challenges. Cuneiform is ambiguous. Many signs have multiple possible readings depending on context. Sumerian, as a language isolate unrelated to any known language family, contains concepts without direct English equivalents. Akkadian, a Semitic language related to Hebrew and Arabic, is more transparent but still operates within a worldview foreign to modern Western thought. Consider the phrase found in Ka 4, a Middle Babylonian text describing the creation of humans. The text states that they slaughtered a god in their assembly, and with his blood they created mankind. The Akkadian verb used is duku, which means to kill, to slay, or to sacrifice. The noun is demu, meaning blood. But what does it mean for gods to kill a god and use his blood? Mainstream interpretation understands this as mythological symbolism. The divine essence enters humanity through the sacrifice god's blood, distinguishing humans from animals, explaining our rationality and moral capacity. The murdered god, in some versions identified as We'ila or Iloela, represents the rebellious principle that must be destroyed to create civilized order, and his blood transmits intelligence to humanity. But the text presents this as procedure. A god is selected. He is killed. His blood is mixed with clay. The mixture is shaped. Beings result. The sequence is causal. Because this happened, that resulted. The language is not poetic. It is descriptive. Alternative interpretations suggest that blood might represent genetic material, that the process described might be an ancient attempt to explain biological engineering in available vocabulary. If the Sumerians witnessed or inherited memory of a process where genetic material from one type of being was combined with material from Earth to produce a new type of being, how would they describe it? They would use the closest available concepts. Blood carries life essence, clay is the material of earth, mixing them under divine direction produces new life. This interpretation requires reading the tablets as attempting to describe a real process rather than constructing religious metaphor. It is not the standard academic approach, but it is one way to account for why multiple independent texts describe human creation using the same procedural framework. Another interpretive challenge is the purpose clause. Texts consistently state why humans were created: to bear the load of the gods, to dig the canals, to till the soil, to mine the earth. This is not incidental. It is the explicit motivation for human creation. The Anunnaki needed workers. They designed workers. They produced workers. If this is mythology, it is unusually pragmatic mythology. Most creation myths explain human purpose as worship, as companionship for the divine, as fulfillment of cosmic order. The Sumerian texts are blunt. Humans exist to work. This could reflect Sumerian social structure, where most humans did in fact labour for temple and palace complexes. Creating a mythology where humans were designed for labour justifies this social arrangement. Or the texts describe the actual reason humanity was created. The distinction between these interpretations is not trivial. If the tablets are pure mythology, they are interesting cultural artefacts, but say nothing about actual human origins. If they preserve distorted memory of real events, events involving genetic manipulation by beings called Anunnaki, they represent historical documentation of extraordinary importance. Scholars avoid the second interpretation not because the texts contradict it, but because accepting it requires overturning established understanding of human history, of our origins, of the timeline of technological development. It is easier, safer, and more academically defensible to read the texts as mythology. But the texts do not insist on being read that way. They present themselves as history. They use the language of procedure and sequence. They maintain consistency across independent sources. and they come from a civilization that documented everything else with obsessive accuracy. When Sumerian tablets describe the area of a field, we trust the mathematics. When they describe the rising of Venus, we confirm the astronomy. When they describe surgical procedures, we recognize medical knowledge. But when they describe the creation of humans by the Anunnaki through mixing divine blood with clay, we call it mythology. Perhaps we are right to do so. Perhaps the Sumerians, for this one topic alone, abandoned their procedural precision and wrote fantasy. Or perhaps we are misunderstanding what kind of document these tablets preserve. Perhaps they are trying to tell us something we have not yet learned to hear. The tablets exist. The translations are reliable. The question is what we do with what they say. The labour problem. Tablet BM 78941 in the British Museum's collection begins the Atra-Hasis epic with a problem. Not a theological problem or a cosmic imbalance, but a practical one. The gods are exhausted. The text describes a situation that has persisted for 40 years. The Igigi gods, lesser deities in the divine hierarchy, have been performing heavy labour. They dig canals, they dredge rivers, they excavate earth, they carry baskets of soil. The work is continuous, demanding, and apparently endless. The Anunnaki, the senior gods, have assigned this labour to the Igigi, and for 40 years the Igigi have complied. Then they stop. The text describes their rebellion in specific terms. The Igigi gather in the night. They complain of the burden. They decide to confront Enlil, one of the chief Anunnaki, at his dwelling. They burn their tools. They march to Enlil's gate. They surround his house. The steward reports the disturbance. Enlil bolts his door. This is not divine metaphor. This is a labour strike, described with the same practical detail found in administrative records of worker complaints from later periods. The Igigi have had enough. They refuse to continue. They demand relief. Enlil summons the other senior Anunnaki, Anu, the sky god, Enki, god of wisdom and fresh water. A council convenes. The situation is assessed. The question is practical. Who will do the work if the Igigi will not? The text preserves dialogue. Enlil is angry, wanting to punish the rebellion. Anu is more circumspect, acknowledging the work is indeed heavy. Enki, the problem solver, proposes a solution. He addresses Nintu, also called Mami or Ninmar, the mother goddess, birth goddess, skilled in creation. Enki proposes that Nintu create a new being, one designed specifically to bear the labour that is destroying the Igigi. The proposal is accepted. Nintu agrees to attempt it, but she requires materials and assistance. The text specifies what happens next. A god must be slaughtered. His blood must be collected. Clay from the Abzu, the primordial underground freshwater realm associated with Enki, must be obtained. The blood and clay must be mixed. Nintu, with the assistance of Enki, will shape this mixture into the form of the new being. The process will be repeated to produce multiple individuals. The text uses technical language for this creation. The verb to create is ban, which can mean to build, to construct, to shape. It is the verb used for constructing a building or fashioning a tool. The noun for the resulting being is lul, which means human or primitive human, but carries connotations of wildness, of a creature less than the gods, but more than animals. What is striking is the procedural tone. The text does not describe spontaneous divine speech bringing humanity into being, as in some creation traditions. It describes a project. Materials are gathered, a procedure is followed, a product results, and the product is designed for a specific function, labour. The text continues with the creation process. 7 males and 7 females are formed. The gestation period is mentioned, 10 months, interestingly not 9, though interpretations vary on whether this is meant literally or symbolically. The goddess Nintu shapes each one, speaking incantations over them, determining their fate. When the process is complete, humans exist. The text then describes what happens to them. They are assigned tasks. They dig the canals the Igigi refuse to dig, they dredge the rivers, they cultivate the fields, they build the temples. The work continues, but now humans perform it instead of gods. The Igigi are freed from labour, the problem is solved, the system functions. What exactly is the text describing? The mainstream interpretation is that this myth explains the social order of Mesopotamia. Most people labour for the benefit of temple and palace complexes. This economic structure is justified theologically by claiming humans were created specifically for this purpose. The myth explains why life is hard, why work is necessary, why some command and others obey. It is social commentary presented as divine prehistory. This interpretation has merit. Ancient societies often used mythology to justify existing power structures. If the gods designed humans to serve, then servitude is natural, ordained, inescapable. The myth functions as social control, making the economic system seem cosmically necessary rather than humanly constructed. But this reading does not account for certain details. Why does the text specify 40 years of divine labour before the rebellion? Why does it describe the Igigi burning their tools, a detail that adds nothing to the theological message, but everything to a narrative of actual events? Why does it include the procedural steps of creation, slaughtering a god, collecting blood, mixing with clay, when saying the gods created humans would suffice for ideological purposes? The text includes detail beyond what mythology requires. It reads less like parable and more like documentation. Consider the specific tasks mentioned. Canal digging is not generic labour. It is hydraulic engineering, essential for Mesopotamian agriculture. The region's fertility depended entirely on irrigation systems diverting water from the Tigris and Euphrates to fields that would otherwise be desert. Building and maintaining these canals required massive labour forces working continuously. Mesopotamian administrative texts document the organisation of these labour forces in later periods. Work gangs, ration systems, supervisors, quotas. Mining is also specified in some versions of the creation narrative. Though Mesopotamia itself lacked metal ores, Sumerian trade networks extended to regions rich in copper, tin, gold, silver. Extracting these resources required mining operations. Some interpretations of the Anunnaki narrative suggest that mining was the primary purpose for human creation, with the gods needing gold or other metals for reasons the texts do not fully explain. The emphasis on labour as the purpose of human creation is consistent across multiple texts. It is not incidental background. It is the reason given for our existence. We were engineered to work. If we take this claim seriously, even as a thought experiment, implications follow. It suggests that humanity as we know it is not the product of purely natural evolution, but of intervention and design. It suggests that traits we consider definitional, our intelligence, our physicality, our capacity for language and tool use, were deliberately incorporated because they serve the function for which we were created. This would explain certain anomalies in human evolution that mainstream paleoanthropology struggles to address. The rapid increase in brain size over the past 2 million years, the sudden appearance of behavioural modernity around 50,000 years ago, the development of agriculture simultaneously in multiple regions around 10,000 BCE. If humans were designed for labour, and if that design involved incorporating genetic material from more advanced beings, the acceleration of human cognitive and cultural development might reflect engineering rather than random mutation and selection. This is speculation. But it is speculation prompted by what the tablets actually say. They say we were created by the Anunnaki. They say we were created from clay mixed with divine blood. They say we were created to perform labour the gods no longer wished to do. They say this happened in response to a specific crisis at a specific time. Either this is mythology constructed to justify social inequality, or it is historical memory preserved in the only vocabulary available to describe what actually occurred. The text of Atra-Hasis does not present itself as allegory, it presents itself as sequence. This problem emerged, this council convened, this solution was proposed, this procedure was followed, this result occurred. The narrative structure is causal and chronological. It is the structure of history, not myth. In the British Museum, tablet BM 78941 sits among thousands of other cuneiform documents. Most are mundane, ration receipts, loan contracts, letters between merchants. They are treated as historical documents because they describe ordinary life. But when a tablet from the same civilization, written in the same script, using the same documentary style, describes extraordinary events, we shift interpretive frameworks and call it mythology. Perhaps that shift is justified. Perhaps the extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and clay tablets alone, no matter how consistent, do not constitute proof of genetic engineering by ancient advanced beings. But the tablets are evidence of something. They are evidence that the Sumerians, the people who gave us writing, mathematics, law, and urban civilization, consistently claimed their origins involved deliberate creation by the Anunnaki for the purpose of labour. They did not claim gradual evolution. They did not claim divine breath into dust. They claimed biological engineering, specific materials mixed in specific ways to produce beings designed for specific tasks. What they described sounds impossible, but the precision with which they described it suggests they were trying to preserve something they believed had actually happened. The question is whether we are willing to consider that they might have been right. The Conference of the Gods. After the Ijigi rebellion, the Atra-Hasis text describes a council. Enlil, shaken by the confrontation at his door, calls together the senior Anunnaki. The assembly is formal. Anu arrives, the supreme authority, god of heaven. Enki comes from the Abzu, the deep freshwater source. Nintu, the mother goddess, is summoned. Lesser gods attend but do not speak. This is a meeting of the High Council, those who decree fate. The text records their deliberation. This is unusual. Most mythologies present divine decisions as immediate, spontaneous, without process. Gods speak and reality conforms. But the Atra-Hasis text shows gods debating, disagreeing, proposing solutions, weighing consequences. It portrays divine decision-making as procedural, as though the Anunnaki operated within constraints, solving problems rather than simply willing outcomes. Enlil speaks first. He is angry about the rebellion. He wants to know who instigated it, who convinced the Ijigi to stop working, to burn their tools, to surround his house in the night. He views it as insurrection against legitimate authority and wants punishment. The text does not give us Anu's response in full, but it suggests that Anu acknowledges the Ijigi grievance. The work was heavy, 40 years of continuous labour. The complaint has basis. Punishment alone will not solve the problem. If the Ijigi will not work, someone else must. This is when Enki proposes the solution. The text presents his speech in direct discourse, one of the most detailed divine speeches in Sumerian literature. Enki addresses Nintu directly. He acknowledges her skill at creation. He proposes that she create a new being, one that will bear the burden currently destroying the Ijigi. This being will be called Lul, human. But Enki does not just propose the idea, he outlines the method, and this is where the text becomes procedurally specific in ways that trouble conventional interpretation. Enki states that a god must be slaughtered, not as punishment, but as material source. The god's blood and flesh will provide the essence, the divine component. This will be mixed with clay, the earthly component. Nintu, using her skill, will shape the mixture. The result will be a being that is part divine and part earthly, combining the intelligence and capabilities of the gods with the mortality and materiality of earth. Why is this procedure necessary? Why can't the gods simply create humans from nothing by divine command? The text does not explain, but it implies limitation. The gods can manipulate existing materials, but they follow processes. There are rules, methods, ingredients. This is not omnipotence. This is capability constrained by procedure. Nintu responds. Her reply is preserved fragmentarily, but she agrees to attempt the creation. However, she specifies that she needs assistance. She cannot do this alone. Enki must help her. The other gods must be present. She will need the Igigi themselves to participate in some way that the damaged text does not fully preserve. A god is chosen for slaughter. Different versions of the text identify him differently. In some he is called Wei-Ila or Iluela. In others he is Geshtu-E, whose name means ear or intelligence. This god is described as having Te'ema, a word meaning reason, comprehension, or understanding. He is selected specifically because he possesses this quality, and it is this quality that will be transferred to humanity. The choice of victim is not random. The god to be killed must have the attribute the new beings need. If humans are to perform complex labour, digging canals, building cities, mining resources, they need intelligence. So a god who embodies intelligence is sacrificed, and his blood, carrying his essence, his Te'ema, will transfer that capacity to the created beings. The slaughter is performed. The text uses the verb daku, to kill or slay. The god's blood is collected. Clay is brought. Nintu mixes them. Here the text provides procedural details that read like a recipe. Nintu is described as pinching off pieces of the mixture, 14 pieces total. 7 are designated male, 7 female. She places them in specific locations. She speaks incantations over them. The text mentions Astu, birth goddesses who assist in the gestation process. The mixture must undergo a developmental period. 10 months are specified. Different translations render this as 10 lunar months or 10 calendar months, but the time period is consistent across versions. The mixture is not simply moulded and animated. It requires time to develop, as though a biological process were occurring. When the time is complete, humans emerge. The text does not describe miraculous animation or divine breath. It describes birth. The birth goddesses attend. Nintu acts as midwife. The beings are delivered. 7 males, 7 females. The first humans. What exactly is being described here? Mainstream scholarship interprets this as mythological explanation for the mystery of birth and the origin of humanity. The gods model the creation process on human reproduction, which the ancients observed but did not fully understand. The mixing of divine blood with clay symbolizes the dual nature of humanity, mortal but possessing divine spark. The 10-month gestation parallels human pregnancy. The myth projects human biology onto the divine realm and then back onto human origins, creating a cyclical metaphor. This interpretation treats the text as theology, as meditation on human nature and divine power. It is reasonable and aligns with how scholars approach other ancient creation narratives. The gods create humans in their image, but diminished, designed to serve. The procedural detail is literary ornamentation, making the narrative vivid and memorable. But the text structure resists this reading, because it does not read like meditation. It reads like instruction. Consider the level of specificity. A god with a specific attribute must be selected. His blood and flesh must be obtained. These must be mixed with clay from a specific source, the Abzu Enki's domain. The mixture must be divided into 14 portions. These must be shaped and placed. Incantations must be spoken. Birth goddesses must attend. A gestation period must elapse. The result is 7 males and 7 females, a founding population. If this is metaphor, it is extraordinarily detailed metaphor. If it is theology, it is theology that operates like engineering documentation. The text does not explain why these steps are necessary. It simply describes them as the steps that were followed, as though someone were recording a procedure so it could be replicated or remembered. Alternative interpretations of the text suggest that what is being described in the only vocabulary available to Bronze Age scribes, is a form of genetic engineering. The blood of the god represents genetic material from an advanced being. The clay represents human or hominid genetic material already present on Earth. The mixing is integration of these genetic lines. The gestation is the developmental period required for the hybrid organism. The result is anatomically modern humans, possessing enhanced intelligence and capabilities derived from the divine genetic contribution. This interpretation is not academically mainstream. It is speculative and requires reading ancient texts as attempts to describe technological processes beyond the writer's full comprehension, but it accounts for details the metaphorical reading struggles to explain. Why specify 10 months? Why mention multiple birth goddesses? Why describe the mixture being divided and shaped into specific numbers? Why emphasize that the god to be slaughtered must possess intelligence if intelligence is not literally being transferred? The text also addresses the question of why this procedure works. Nintu mixes the blood and clay, but Enki provides the understanding. He is described as wise, as possessing knowledge the others lack. He knows how to perform this creation. He knows what materials are needed, what process to follow. This is not spontaneous divine action. This is applied knowledge. In the Enki and Ninhursag text, another Sumerian composition describing human creation, Enki and Ninhursag actually compete to see who can create the most capable being. This framing suggests that creation is a skill, a craft, something gods can be better or worse at. The text describes Ninhursag creating 6 beings with various defects, one without hands, one unable to hold his urine, one without speech. Enki then creates a being so weak and malformed that Ninhursag cannot find a use for him. It reads like experimentation, like trial and error, like a design process. If the gods are omnipotent, why do they make mistakes? Why do they need multiple attempts? Why does the text describe failures before success? Unless creation is not omnipotent willing, but procedural engineering, with attendant risks of error. The council scene in Atra-Hasis shows gods constrained by circumstance, solving problems with available tools, debating methods, requiring specific materials and knowledge to achieve their goal. They are powerful, yes, far beyond human capacity, but they are not presented as infinite. They are presented as capable engineers working within natural laws, even if those laws are beyond human understanding. When the first humans are successfully created, the text describes the gods' response. They are satisfied. The beings function as designed. The labour can now be delegated. The Igigi are released from their burden. The system stabilises, and humanity begins the work we were allegedly created to perform. The work we still, thousands of years later, primarily spend our lives doing. We dig, we build, we mine, we cultivate, we carry, we labour, just as the tablets say we were designed to do. The formula. If we treat the Sumerian creation texts as documenting a procedure rather than constructing mythology, we must examine the formula itself. What exactly do the tablets describe being done? The clearest procedural account comes from Tablet Car 4, a Middle Babylonian text housed in various museum collections with fragments scattered across multiple institutions. Though damaged, the preserved portions describe the creation of humanity with remarkable specificity. The text is bilingual, containing both Sumerian and Akkadian versions, which allows for cross-checking translation and confirms the stability of the narrative across languages. Car 4 states, they slaughtered a god in their assembly, E the Wise, who created all wisdom, and with his blood they created mankind. He imposed the service and let free the gods. The structure is clear, a god is killed, blood is obtained, mankind is created from the blood, service is imposed, gods are freed from labour. This is presented as causal sequence. Each step leads to the next. The tablet continues with more detail about the process. The blood must be mixed with clay. The mixture must be kneaded. like dough for bread or clay for pottery. The text uses words that appear in Mesopotamian texts describing craft production. This is manufacturing language applied to biological creation. In the Atra-Hasis account, the god to be sacrificed is Geshtu-e, the god who had intelligence. The text emphasizes this attribute because it explains what humans will receive from the divine component. The phrase used is mu, which means reason, understanding, rational thought. When his blood is mixed with clay and shaped into humans, the mu transfers. Humans have intelligence not because it evolved naturally, but because it was incorporated from a divine source. The clay is also specified. It must come from the Abzu, the underground freshwater source associated with Enki. In Mesopotamian cosmology, the Abzu is the foundation of the earth, the primordial deep from which fresh water springs. It is Enki's domain, the place of his knowledge and power. Why must the clay specifically come from there? If we read this as mythology, the Abzu clay symbolizes pure, uncorrupted earth material, blessed by Enki's presence. It connects humanity to the foundational depths, to the source of life and fertility. The choice is poetic and theological. If we read this as procedure, the Abzu clay might represent existing hominid genetic material present on Earth. The clay is the base, the local biological substrate into which the divine genetic contribution will be integrated. Enki's association with the Abzu could indicate that this substrate falls under his area of expertise, biological forms, earthly life, genetic material already present on the planet. The mixing process is described in multiple texts. Nintu, the mother goddess, performs the mixing with Enki's guidance. She kneads the clay and blood together. The Akkadian verb is balu, which means to mix, to mingle, to combine different substances into a homogeneous whole. This is the same verb used in medical texts for compounding prescriptions, mixing ingredients to create remedies. Once mixed, the substance is divided. The texts consistently mention 14 portions, 7 male, 7 female. Why 14? Why this specific sexual differentiation from the beginning? If the gods are simply creating one prototype, why create 14 simultaneously? A genetic interpretation would suggest that 14 represents a minimum viable population for reproductive diversity. Creating fewer might produce inbreeding problems in subsequent generations. Creating more would require more divine blood, more sacrifice, more of the rare divine genetic material. 14 is small enough to be manageable, but large enough to establish a genetically diverse founding population. Each portion is shaped. The verb used is ibtu, which means image, likeness, or deliberately crafted form. Nintu shapes each one intentionally. She does not produce formless matter that will later develop into human form. She crafts the shape from the beginning. The image invoked is sculptural, artisanal. The creator forms the material as a potter forms a vessel. Incantations are spoken over the forming beings. Multiple texts mention this. The words spoken are not preserved completely, but fragments survive. Nintu determines fate, assigns destiny, speaks creative power over the material. This could be ritual, or it could be encoding information into the mixture, programming it, giving instructions that will guide the developmental process. Then comes gestation. The shaped material does not immediately become living beings. A time period is required. The texts specify 10 months. The birth goddesses, called Asrachu, oversee this period. They are described as attending, watching, waiting. At the end of 10 months, humans emerge. The language used for emergence is birth language, Aldu, to bear, to give birth. The beings are not animated from inert matter, they are born. This suggests that the mixture, once shaped and spoken over, undergoes biological development analogous to pregnancy. If we map modern genetic concepts onto this ancient description, a possible picture emerges. Advanced beings, or Ghul, require a labour force to perform tasks on Earth. local hominids exist, but lack sufficient cognitive capacity for complex tasks. The Anunnaki decide to create enhanced hominids by integrating their own genetic material into the existing hominid genome. A member of the Anunnaki is selected based on desirable cognitive traits. Genetic material is extracted, blood in the texts, as blood was understood to carry essence and inheritance. This material is combined with the genetic material of local hominids, clay from the Abzu. The integration is performed using biological techniques, mixing and kneading. The mixed genetic material is implanted into surrogate wombs, possibly those of birth goddesses or female Anunnaki, the Asatu who assist. The embryos develop over 10 months, slightly longer than typical human gestation, possibly because the hybrid genetics require additional development time. 7 males and 7 females are brought to term. These are the first anatomically modern humans possessing both hominid physicality and Anunnaki cognitive enhancement. This interpretation is speculative and requires projecting modern genetic science onto Bronze Age texts. But it is striking how well the ancient description maps onto what such a process would require. Genetic material from 2 sources, mixing, implantation, gestation, birth of a small founding population sexually differentiated to enable reproduction. The Barton cylinder, CBS 8383, at the Penn Museum, dates to around 2500 BC and is among the earliest written versions of this creation narrative. Though heavily damaged, it describes similar elements: divine decision to create humans, use of specific materials, shaping by a birth goddess, assignment of human labour. The consistency across texts separated by 1,000 years suggests a stable tradition, a core narrative preserved because it was considered important. Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, recorded on tablets including K3473 in the British Museum, contains similar creation formula. After the god Marduk defeats Tiamat and creates the cosmos, he proposes creating humans to serve the gods. The god Chingu, Tiamat's consort, is killed. His blood is used to fashion mankind. The text states, "Out of his blood they fashion mankind. He imposed the service and let free the gods." Again the same structure: God killed, blood used, mankind made, service imposed, gods freed. The wording in Enuma Elish parallels Ka 4 so closely that scholars recognise them as different versions of the same tradition. This is not a single isolated myth. This is a core narrative of Mesopotamian civilization, repeated across cities, across centuries, across different dynasties and empires. The Sumerians told it, the Akkadians told it, the Babylonians told it, the Assyrians told it, and they all told it the same way. Humans were created by mixing divine blood with earthly clay to produce labourers. The mainstream explanation for this consistency is that Mesopotamian culture was remarkably conservative, that traditions passed from Sumer through successive civilizations, maintaining narrative stability because the social function justifying human servitude remained constant. Later empires adopted Sumerian myths because adopting Sumerian culture conferred legitimacy. This is true, but it does not explain why this particular formula, blood and clay, mixed and shaped, remains consistent. Myths evolve, details change, storytellers embellish or simplify. Yet across 1500 years and multiple cultures, the creation formula holds stable: blood and clay, mixing and shaping, gestation and birth, labour and service. Either this stability reflects theological importance, the formula must not change because it represents cosmic truth, or it reflects historical importance. It must not change because it describes what actually happened, and preserving the accurate procedure is the point. In Mesopotamian medicine, prescriptions were recorded with exact proportions. 2 parts this plant, 1 part that mineral, half part of another substance mixed in water applied to the affected area. Precision mattered because the prescription had to work. Recording it accurately meant future healers could replicate the treatment. The creation formula is recorded with similar precision. Not poetic variation, but procedural consistency, as though someone were trying to preserve exactly how it was done, the way a recipe is preserved, the way a technique is transmitted. The tablets describe a procedure for creating humans. They repeat that procedure across multiple independent texts. They maintain the same materials, the same steps, the same outcome. They present it as history, as something that occurred at a specific time for a specific reason. We call it mythology because accepting it as anything else would require rethinking everything we believe about human origins. But the tablets do not call it mythology, they call it history. They describe it as procedure. The question is, which interpretation does justice to what the texts actually preserve? Enki's laboratory. In the Sumerian pantheon, Enki occupies a unique position. He is not the supreme god, that is An or Anu. He is not the most powerful, that is often Enlil, god of wind and storm. But Enki is the wisest. He is the god of intelligence, of fresh water, of craftsmanship, of magic, of creation. When problems require solutions, the other gods turn to Enki. His name means Lord of the Earth, but his domain is more specific. The Abzu, the underground freshwater ocean, believed to lie beneath the surface of the world. In Mesopotamian cosmology, the Abzu is where Enki dwells, where he conducts his work, where his knowledge is stored. It is laboratory, library, and workshop combined. When the Anunnaki face the problem of the Igigi rebellion, it is Enki who proposes the solution. More than that, Enki knows how to implement it. He possesses knowledge the other gods lack. He understands the process of creation. He knows what materials are needed, what procedure to follow, how to ensure success. This suggests that Enki has performed biological creation before, or at least studied it extensively. The text Enki and Ninhursag, preserved in the electronic text corpus of Sumerian literature at Oxford, provides additional detail about Enki's role. This composition describes a feast among the gods after the creation of humanity. The gods are celebrating, drinking beer, becoming intoxicated. In their drunken state, Enki and Ninhursag begin to argue about their respective roles in creating humans. Ninhursag boasts that she shaped the human form, that her skill determined how humans would look and function. Enki counters that without his wisdom, without his knowledge of the procedure, Ninhursag could have shaped nothing. They challenge each other to a creation contest. Ninhursag goes first. She creates a being who cannot bend his outstretched hands. Enki examines the creation and declares he can find a function for such a being. He will be a servant who stands before the king. Ninhursag creates another being who cannot control his urine. Enki assigns him to work in a specific craft where this defect does not matter. She creates a being unable to speak. Enki makes him a court attendant where silence is valued. 6 times Ninhursag creates beings with various defects. 6 times Enki finds uses for them. This demonstrates both Enki's cleverness and the possibility of failure in the creation process. The beings Ninhursag makes do not turn out as intended. They have problems, limitations, design flaws, but they are alive, and Enki, with his wisdom, can mitigate their deficiencies. Then Enki takes his turn. He creates a being so malformed and weak that Ninhursag cannot assign him any function. She protests that this creation is useless, that Enki has deliberately made something too broken to serve any purpose. Enki has proven his point. Without the correct knowledge and procedure, creation produces failures. What is this text describing? Mainstream scholarship reads it as theological meditation on fate and the role of wisdom in accepting inevitable suffering. The defective beings represent humans born with disabilities, and the text explores whether such lives have meaning and purpose. Enki's wisdom finds value in what appears useless. The message is that divine wisdom transcends human judgment about worth. This interpretation is thoughtful and aligns with Mesopotamian wisdom literature's emphasis on accepting the gods' inscrutable decisions. But it does not explain why the text frames this as a creation contest, why it describes multiple attempts, why it emphasizes that beings can be made incorrectly. An alternative reading suggests that the text preserves memory of an experimental phase in human creation. Before the successful model, anatomically modern humans with full cognitive capacity, there were earlier attempts. Beings were created with various defects, various combinations of traits, various strengths and weaknesses. Some attempts produced viable but limited beings. Other attempts produced beings so flawed they could not survive or function. This would align with what we know from paleoanthropology about human evolution. Multiple hominid species existed simultaneously. Homo habilis, Homo erectus, Homo neanderthalensis, Homo sapiens. They overlapped in time and space. They had different capabilities, different anatomical features, different cognitive capacities. Standard evolutionary theory explains this as branching descent from common ancestors, with natural selection favouring certain lines over others. But what if these different hominid types represent different attempts at creating a viable human worker? What if the Anunnaki experimented with different combinations of divine and earthly genetic material, producing various prototypes before achieving the desired result? The text would then be preserving actual history, encoded as divine competition, because the Sumerians understood the process in theological terms. This interpretation is highly speculative, but it accounts for textual details that the theological reading treats as narrative ornamentation. The text describes beings being created with specific defects. It describes multiple attempts. It describes some attempts being more successful than others. It describes the eventual production of a being so flawed it has no use. This is the language of experimentation and design iteration, not the language of omnipotent divine will. Enki's role throughout these texts is consistent. He is the technical expert. He knows procedures. He can diagnose problems. He can adjust processes to achieve different results. He operates less like an omnipotent deity and more like a highly skilled geneticist or biological engineer working within natural laws he deeply understands. The Eridu-Genesis, tablet CBS 10673 at the Penn Museum, describes the creation of humanity and the establishment of cities as occurring under Enki's direction in his cult city of Eridu. The text is fragmentary, but it places Enki at the centre of both biological and social engineering. He creates humans, and he establishes the systems, kingship, priesthood, irrigation, that allow human civilization to function. Why is Enki consistently assigned this role? In Mesopotamian theology, each god has a domain, a sphere of influence and expertise. Anu rules heaven, Enlil rules earth and atmosphere, Shamash governs justice and the sun, Ishtar Inanna governs love, sex and war, Enki governs wisdom, magic, craftsmanship and creation. But Enki's association with creation is not abstract. It is procedural. He does not create by divine fiat, but by applied knowledge. He understands how things work. He knows techniques. He solves problems through intelligence rather than raw power. This makes Enki the most likely divine candidate for performing genetic engineering if such a project occurred. He would be the one who understood biology, who could manipulate genetic material, who could design organisms with specific traits. His association with the Abzu, the deep waters, the underground realm, could represent access to biological resources, to the genetic material of existing earthly organisms from which enhanced humans could be created. Ninma, also called Nintu or Mami, complements Enki in the creation process. She is the mother goddess, the birth goddess. Her expertise is gestation and delivery. If Enki is the geneticist designing the organism, Ninma is the specialist in bringing that organism to term. She provides the womb, oversees development, delivers the child. The texts emphasize that both are necessary. Enki cannot create without Ninmah, and Ninmah cannot create without Enki. One provides knowledge, the other provides biological capacity. Together they produce humans. This partnership appears in multiple creation accounts. In Atra-Hasis, Enki proposes the method, but Nintu performs the actual creation, with Enki providing guidance. In Enki and Ninmah, they work together despite their competitive argument. In Ka 4, both are credited with the creation. If we treat these texts as preserving memory of actual events, Enki emerges as the chief scientist of the Anunnaki, the one who understood biological processes well enough to engineer a new organism. His laboratory in the Abzu is where this work occurred. His wisdom is technical knowledge. His magic is applied science, advanced beyond what Bronze Age scribes could otherwise describe. The consistency of Enki's role across multiple independent texts suggests that his association with human creation was not arbitrary. Whatever event or process underlies these narratives, Enki was understood to be centrally involved. The Sumerians remembered him as the creator, or at least as the designer, of humanity. Later Mesopotamian tradition continued to credit Enki with deep knowledge of biological processes. Medical incantations invoked Enki as the source of healing knowledge. Texts describe Enki teaching the secrets of the body to human physicians. He is patron of the Az, the healer, the one who understands physical ailments and their remedies. This is consistent with portraying Enki as the Anunnaki's biological engineer. If he created humans, he would understand human physiology completely. He could teach healing because he designed the body. His knowledge would be comprehensive because it was design knowledge, not merely observational knowledge. In the Adapa legend, fragments of which are preserved on tablets K8214 and K8743 in the British Museum, Enki creates Adapa, described as the wisest of men. But Adapa is not fully human. He is Enki's special creation, given exceptional intelligence, wisdom beyond other humans. Enki makes Adapa perfect in understanding, but deliberately does not grant him immortality. Adapa is presented as a prototype, a demonstration of what could be achieved if Enki fully expressed his capabilities in a human form. But Adapa is not replicated. He remains unique, evidence that Enki could create humans with different trait profiles, that he had control over what capacities to include or exclude. This aligns with the idea of Enki as genetic engineer. If he designed baseline humans for labour, he could also design exceptional humans for specialised roles. Adapa is that experiment, a human with near divine intelligence, but still mortal, still human, still separate from the gods. The question this raises is whether other legendary figures in Sumerian literature, kings with impossibly long reigns, heroes with exceptional abilities, sages who possessed extraordinary knowledge, were also products of deliberate design rather than natural birth. Were the antediluvian kings listed in the Sumerian king list biologically exceptional because they were early models, closer to the original Anunnaki genetic contribution? The texts do not explicitly state this, but they consistently describe Enki as capable of creating beings with variable traits, of choosing what to include and exclude, of producing both baseline and exceptional humans, depending on purpose. If human creation involved genetic engineering, Enki is remembered as the engineer, the Abzu is remembered as his workshop, and Ninmah is remembered as the one who brought his designs to life. Whether we read this as theology or as distorted technological history, the pattern is clear. The Sumerians believed their existence resulted from deliberate design by knowledgeable beings who understood biological processes and could manipulate them to achieve specific outcomes. They believed they were created intentionally for a purpose, by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. The prototype failures. The existence of defective creations in the Enki and Ninhursag text raises a question that pure theology struggles to answer. Why would omnipotent gods create failed beings? If the Anunnaki possessed unlimited power, if creation was simply a matter of divine will imposed on reality, there would be no mistakes. A god speaks, reality conforms, the desired result manifests. This is how many creation traditions work. Divine command produces perfect execution, but Mesopotamian creation narratives describe imperfect results. Ninmah creates beings who do not function correctly. Enki creates a being so malformed it has no use. These failures are not presented as moral failings or symbolic representations of human imperfection. They are described as design errors, as beings that do not work as intended. The first being Ninmah creates cannot bend his outstretched hands. The Sumerian text says his hands cannot approach his body. The being is frozen in a single position, arms extended. This is a mobility defect, a problem with skeletal or muscular structure. Enki must devise a social role where this defect does not prevent function, placing the being as a servant who stands before the king, where stillness is required. The second being cannot control his urine. This is a urological or neurological defect. The being lacks sphincter control, a basic bodily function. Again, Enki finds a role where this limitation can be managed, but the creation itself is not what was intended. The third being has problems with his feet. He cannot walk properly. This is a locomotor defect. The fourth cannot retain semen. The fifth cannot give birth. These are reproductive defects. The sixth cannot speak or hear. These are sensory and communication defects. Each being has a specific biological problem. Ninmah is attempting to create humans, but keeps producing variants with single system failures. This does not read like theological symbolism. It reads like a design process going wrong. If we accept, even as thought experiment, that these texts preserve memory of genetic engineering, the failures make sense. Genetic manipulation is complex. Integrating genetic material from two different species, Anunnaki and hominid, would risk developmental problems. Regulatory genes might not function correctly, protein expression might be disrupted, organ systems might not form properly. The result would be beings with specific defects depending on which systems failed to develop correctly. Modern genetic engineering of animals produces similar results. When scientists attempt to create transgenic organisms, early attempts often produce individuals with serious health problems. Some die in utero. Some are born but cannot survive. Some have organ defects. Some have skeletal abnormalities. Only after many attempts with refined techniques and better understanding of gene regulation do successful, healthy transgenic organisms result. The Enki and Ninmah text could be describing exactly this process. Ninmah attempts to create humans. Her early attempts have single system failures. Each new creation has a different problem because she is adjusting her technique, trying to correct previous errors. But she does not yet fully understand the process. The beings she creates are alive but flawed. Enki, with greater knowledge, can create a being that is even more malformed. His creation is described as having every part of his body in distress. He cannot eat, cannot speak, cannot see properly, cannot control his limbs. This being represents complete systemic failure, the result of combining genetic material in a way that produces cascading developmental problems. The implication is clear. Even with the knowledge the Anunnaki possessed, human creation was not simple. It required skill, technique, understanding. It was possible to fail. The process had risks. And before the successful model anatomically modern humans, there were unsuccessful attempts. Paleoanthropology documents the existence of multiple hominid species: Australopithecines, Homo habilis, Homo erectus, Neanderthals, Denisovans, and others. Some had larger brains than predecessors, but smaller than modern humans. Some had advanced tool use. Some had evidence of symbolic thought. Some interbred with modern humans, contributing genetic material still present in living populations. Standard evolutionary theory explains this diversity through branching descent and natural selection. Different populations adapted to different environments, developing different traits. Most eventually went extinct, but Homo sapiens survived and proliferated. But what if some of these hominid variants represent not natural evolutionary branches, but deliberate creations, prototypes, experimental models, attempts to produce a viable human worker before the successful model was achieved? The fossil record would look similar. Multiple hominid forms existing in overlapping time periods, some persisting longer than others, eventually being replaced by anatomically modern humans. The key difference would be causation. Evolution posits natural selection acting on random mutation over millions of years. The Sumerian model posits deliberate design and iteration over a compressed time frame. Certain features of human evolution are difficult to explain through gradual natural selection alone. Brain size tripled over the past 2 million years, an extraordinarily rapid change for such an energetically expensive organ. Bipedalism, while advantageous, involves trade-offs in spinal stress and childbirth difficulty. Human infants are born neurologically immature compared to other primates, requiring extended parental care. Language capacity appears suddenly in the fossil record with little obvious transitional forms. These features are explicable through natural selection, but they require complex, multi-step scenarios. Alternatively, if humans were designed for specific purposes, these features represent design choices. Large brains provide intelligence for complex tasks. Bipedalism frees hands for carrying and tool use. Extended infant development allows neurological complexity. Language enables coordination of labour. The Enki and Ninhursag text describes design choices. Ninhursag tries different configurations. Some work better than others. Enki evaluates each attempt, determining whether it achieves the intended purpose or requires adjustment. Eventually, a successful model is produced. This successful model is described in the Atra-Hasis text, 7 males and 7 females, fully functional, capable of performing the labour required. These are the prototype humans, the ones who work correctly. From these 14, the rest of humanity descends. Genetic studies of modern humans suggest a population bottleneck in our species' history. At some point, the total human population dropped to perhaps 10,000 individuals or fewer, possibly as low as several thousand. This bottleneck is dated to roughly 70,000 years ago, though estimates vary. The genetic diversity of modern humans is remarkably low compared to other primate species, suggesting we all descend from a small ancestral population. A founding population of 14 individuals is too small for long-term viability without inbreeding. But if the 7 males and 7 females represent 7 breeding pairs, who then had many offspring, a viable population could be established. Within a few generations, hundreds of individuals would exist. Within 1,000 years, tens of thousands. The texts describe humanity spreading quickly after creation. We are assigned tasks immediately. We build cities, we dig canals, we cultivate fields. The archaeological record shows exactly this pattern. A relatively sudden appearance of anatomically modern humans, followed by rapid spread across Africa and eventually into other continents. The failures described in Enki and Ninhursag might have occurred before this successful model. They might represent earlier hominid species that the Anunnaki created, but that did not possess the full suite of capabilities required. These earlier versions persisted for a time, but were eventually replaced by the improved model. Or the text might be describing genetic diseases and developmental disorders that occurred in early humans as the engineered genome stabilized across generations. Even a successful genetic integration can produce occasional errors in offspring, especially in early generations, before the genome fully stabilizes. What the text clearly describes is that human creation was not perfect on the first attempt. There were problems. There were adjustments. There was a development process. This is consistent with engineering and inconsistent with omnipotent divine creation. Omnipotence does not require prototypes. Engineering does. The Sumerians preserved this memory. Before humans who worked correctly, there were humans who did not. Before the successful model, there were failures. Creation required skill, knowledge, and multiple attempts. Whether we interpret this as theology reflecting on human imperfection or as historical memory of genetic engineering, the pattern is the same. Humanity as we know it was not the first attempt. We are the successful iteration, the version that worked. The texts remember this. They describe it in detail. They preserve the memory that our creation was procedural, technical, and initially imperfect. What they suggest is that we were not made by a God who spoke and reality conformed. We were made by beings who designed, tested, adjusted, and eventually succeeded in creating an organism fit for the purpose they had in mind. We exist because we work, because we functioned as designed, because the prototype was successful enough to become the production model, and the purpose we were designed for, the texts consistently state, was labour, the work we still spend most of our lives performing, the work the Anunnaki, for their own reasons, no longer wish to do themselves. The Adapa anomaly. Among the earliest humans created by Enki, one stands apart. His name is Adapa, and he is described in fragmentary texts preserved on tablets K8214 and K8743 in the British Museum's collection, as well as fragments from Tel El Amarna in Egypt. Adapa is called the sage, the wise one, the most intelligent of men. He is Enki's special creation, deliberately given extraordinary cognitive capacity. The text states, wide understanding he perfected for him to disclose the designs of the land. To him he gave wisdom, but eternal life he did not give him. This is a crucial statement. Enki made Adapa exceptionally intelligent. He gave him wisdom beyond other humans, but he deliberately did not give him immortality. This suggests that immortality was available to be given, that it was a trait Enki could include or exclude in his creations. He chose not to include it in Adapa, despite making Adapa exceptional in every other way. Why? The Adapa legend provides a narrative answer. Adapa serves as a priest for Enki in Eridu. One day, while fishing to provide offerings for the temple, the south wind capsizes his boat. In anger, Adapa curses the wind and, using power given him by Enki, breaks the wind's wing. The south wind stops blowing for 7 days. Anu, the supreme god in heaven, notices this disruption. He summons Adapa to explain himself. Enki, knowing his creation will be questioned, gives Adapa instructions. He tells Adapa how to behave in heaven, how to address Anu, and critically warns him not to eat or drink anything offered to him in heaven, as it will be food and water of death. Adapa goes to heaven. He answers Anu's questions. Anu is impressed by Adapa's wisdom, by his exceptional intelligence. Anu decides that such a being should not be mortal. He offers Adapa the bread of life and the water of life, which will make him immortal like the gods. But Adapa, following Enki's instructions, refuses. He believes he is being offered death. Anu is confused. Why would Adapa refuse immortality? When Anu learns that Enki instructed Adapa to refuse, he realizes what has happened. Enki has deliberately prevented Adapa from gaining eternal life. Adapa is sent back to Earth, still mortal, still human, despite having been given the chance for immortality. The text ends with Adapa returning to Eridu, wise but doomed to die like all humans. This narrative is rich with interpretive possibilities. Mainstream scholarship reads it as Mesopotamian reflection on the human condition. We possess intelligence, we can reason and understand, but we remain mortal. The gods are capricious. Enki tricked Adapa, or protected him, depending on interpretation. The point is that humanity is separated from the divine by mortality, no matter how wise we become. This reading treats Adapa as symbolic, as representing humanity's limitations. We can be brilliant, but we cannot escape death. We are forever less than the gods. But the text presents Adapa as a historical individual, not as symbolic representation. He lives in Eridu. He serves Enki's temple. He interacts with specific gods. He performs specific actions. The text treats him as real. If Adapa was real, what does his story preserve? One interpretation is that Adapa represents genetic engineering for intelligence. Enki created most humans with sufficient cognitive capacity for labour, understanding commands, performing complex tasks, coordinating with other workers. But in Adapa, Enki amplified these traits. Adapa received enhanced intelligence, wide understanding, cognitive capacity approaching or matching the Anunnaki's own. This would be a test case, an experiment to see how much intelligence could be safely incorporated into a human. The result was impressive. Adapa was brilliant. He understood complex matters. He could reason at levels other humans could not. But Enki deliberately did not give Adapa immortality. Why? Perhaps because combining full Anunnaki intelligence with Anunnaki longevity would create a being too close to the gods themselves. It would blur the distinction between creator and created. It would produce a rival rather than a servant. Enki made Adapa wise enough to serve effectively, but mortal enough to remain controlled. The intelligence would die with Adapa. It would not pass down indefinitely. The experiment would have a natural endpoint. The story of Adapa being offered immortality and refusing it could preserve memory of an attempt to extend his lifespan, perhaps a medical treatment or genetic modification that Adapa, following Enki's advice, rejected. Enki did not want Adapa to become immortal, even though the technology existed to make him so. Adapa remained mortal because that was part of Enki's design. What this demonstrates is that the Anunnaki had control over which traits to include in their human creations. They could modulate intelligence. They could include or exclude longevity. They could design humans with different capacities depending on purpose. Most humans received baseline intelligence and standard human lifespan. Adapa received enhanced intelligence but still standard lifespan. This was deliberate engineering, trait selection, intentional design. Other figures in Sumerian tradition might represent similar experiments. The 7 sages, called the Apkallu, are described as wise men who lived before the flood and taught civilization to humanity. They are associated with Enki, portrayed as his servants or messengers. Later tradition depicts them as semi-divine, possessing knowledge far beyond ordinary humans. Were the Apkallu also enhanced humans, created with exceptional intelligence to serve as intermediaries between the Anunnaki and baseline humanity? Were they teaching knowledge they possessed naturally, or knowledge Enki had implanted in them? The text describes Adapa as disclosing the designs of the land, meaning revealing hidden knowledge, explaining how things work. This is not knowledge Adapa discovered through observation. This is knowledge Enki gave him. It was designed into him, part of his genetic or neurological configuration. This raises the possibility that certain skills, certain knowledge, certain capabilities were directly encoded into specific humans rather than taught externally. If the Anunnaki understood neurology and cognition well enough to enhance intelligence, they might also understand it well enough to imprint specific information, to create humans who innately understood mathematics or astronomy or medicine without needing to learn it. The sudden appearance of advanced knowledge in early Mesopotamia, sophisticated mathematics, precise astronomical observations, complex medical procedures, might reflect not just teaching by the Anunnaki, but direct cognitive enhancement of specific individuals who then transmitted that knowledge to others. Adapa is the clearest example of this. He did not become wise through study. Enki made him wise. His intelligence was a design feature, not an acquired skill. But Enki controlled that intelligence by ensuring Adapa remained mortal. Exceptional intelligence in a mortal being would die out. It would not propagate indefinitely. It would not create a permanent class of super-intelligent humans who might threaten Anunnaki control. This is why Enki tricks Adapa into refusing immortality, because immortal, supremely intelligent humans would be too dangerous. They would learn too much, understand too much, eventually figure out how they were created, and perhaps how to replicate the process. Keeping humanity mortal, even exceptionally intelligent individuals like Adapa, ensures that knowledge remains limited, that each generation must be taught anew, that humans never accumulate enough understanding to rival their creators. This is population control through biological design. The Anunnaki created workers, but they ensured those workers remained dependent, limited, controllable. Intelligence could be granted when needed for specific purposes, but it would not spread uncontrolled through the population. The genetic diversity of modern humans shows that our intelligence is heritable, passed from parents to children. But the text suggests that Adapa's exceptional intelligence might not have been. He might have been genetically sterile, or his enhanced cognitive traits might not have been stable across generations, reverting to baseline in his offspring. This would explain why later humans were not as intelligent as Adapa. The enhancement died with him. It was temporary, intentional, controlled. The Adapa legend functions theologically as an explanation for human mortality despite human intelligence. We can be brilliant, but we still die. This comforts and explains. But it also functions as historical memory of genetic engineering with selective trait expression. Some humans were made smarter for specific purposes, but even enhanced humans remained mortal, remained limited, remained beneath the Anunnaki, because if humanity were designed, control mechanisms would be essential. You do not create a labour force capable of overcoming their designers. You build in limitations, you ensure dependency, you maintain the hierarchy through biology itself. Adapa is the proof that such control was possible. He is brilliant but mortal, exceptional but limited, powerful but ultimately subservient. He is what the Anunnaki could create when they wanted more than a baseline worker, and what they would not create when they wanted safety and control. Adapa is the anomaly that proves the rule. Human traits were designed, selected, controlled. We are what we are not by accident, but by intention. And the beings who designed us ensured that no matter how intelligent we became, we would never fully rival them. Mining, digging, building. The texts are explicit about humanity's purpose. We were created to perform labour the gods no longer wished to do. This is not philosophical speculation or theological interpretation. The tablets state this directly, repeatedly, across multiple independent sources. Atra-Hasis is clearest. Let man assume the drudgery of the god. The workload of the god was too great, the toil was too much. The Anunnaki now create lull to bear the yoke. What exactly was this work? The texts specify canal digging as primary. Mesopotamian civilization depended on irrigation. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers provided water, but that water had to be distributed to fields through artificial canal systems. Building these canals required moving enormous amounts of earth. Maintaining them required constant dredging to prevent silting. This was hard, continuous, essential labour. Sumerian administrative texts from the early dynastic period, around 2600-2350 BCE, document large-scale canal projects. Tablets record work gangs consisting of hundreds or thousands of labourers, organised hierarchically, supervised by overseers, receiving rations of barley and beer as compensation. The organisational structure is sophisticated, indicating long experience managing large-scale manual labour. One text from the city of Lagash, dating to around 2400 BC, describes a canal project employing 5,100 workers over several months. The tablet specifies daily labour quotas, ration distributions, and the names of supervisors. This is industrial scale Earth moving using human muscle power. The Atra-Hasis text describes the Igigi performing exactly this kind of work for 40 years before rebelling. They dug canals, they carried baskets of earth, they excavated rivers. The work was exhausting, unending, crushing. They finally refused to continue. Humans were created to replace them, and humans did continue for thousands of years. We dug the canals, we maintained the irrigation systems, we moved the earth, because that is what we were designed to do. Mining is also specified. Though southern Mesopotamia lacked metal ores, Sumerian civilization required copper, tin, gold, silver. These had to be imported from distant regions, Anatolia, the Caucasus, the Iranian plateau, even as far as Afghanistan for lapis lazuli. Obtaining these resources required mining operations in those distant regions. Some interpretations of the Anunnaki narrative suggest that gold was the primary resource the Anunnaki needed, possibly for technological purposes. Zechariah Sitchin, in his Earth Chronicles series, proposed that the Anunnaki needed gold to repair their planet's atmosphere and that humans were created specifically to mine gold. This interpretation goes beyond what the cuneiform texts explicitly state, but the texts do mention mining as part of human labour. More conservatively, we can note that Mesopotamian civilization required metals for tools, weapons, ritual objects, and trade goods. Acquiring these metals meant either mining them directly or trading with peoples who mined them. Either way, the labour of extraction was essential. Building is the third major category. The ziggurats of Mesopotamia are among the ancient world's most impressive structures. These massive stepped platforms required millions of mud bricks, precisely laid, rising hundreds of feet. Building them required enormous labour forces working for decades. The ziggurat at Ur, partially reconstructed and still visible today, measures roughly 210 feet by 150 feet at its base, and originally rose about 70 feet high. It was built entirely of mud bricks. Estimates suggest it contains over 7 million bricks, each made by hand, dried in the sun or baked in kilns, carried to the construction site, laid in courses, and cemented with bitumen. Who performed this labour? Humans. Because that is what we were created to do. We build what the gods design. We execute their plans through physical work. Sumerian temple hymns describe humans as bearers of baskets, diggers of canals, builders of cities. These are not incidental descriptions. They are definitional. They describe human purpose. Mainstream scholarship interprets this as ideological. Mesopotamian society was hierarchical, with most people labouring for temple and palace institutions, so the mythology reflects and justifies this social structure by claiming humans were created specifically to serve. This interpretation is reasonable. Myths often justify existing power relationships by portraying them as divinely ordained. If humans were created to serve, then the ruling classes can claim they are simply implementing divine will by organising labour. But the texts predate the major palace economies of later Mesopotamian history. The earliest Sumerian cities, in the Uruk period around 3500–3100 BC, show evidence of temple-centred economies, but not yet the elaborate palace bureaucracies of later periods. The ideology claiming humans were created for labour appears before the social structures it supposedly justifies are fully developed. This suggests the mythology might not be post hoc justification, but primary claim. The Sumerians might have organised their society around large-scale collective labour because they believed that was humanity's purpose, not created the mythology to justify organisation they developed for other reasons. If the Anunnaki actually created humans for labour, then the early appearance of this claim in Sumerian literature makes sense. It is the foundational truth upon which Sumerian civilization is built. Humans exist to work. Cities exist to organise that work. Temples exist to direct it on behalf of the gods. The alternative explanation that humans gradually developed urban civilization and then invented gods who commanded them to do what they were already doing requires asking why the Sumerians would invent such a mythology. Most creation myths emphasize human importance, divine love, cosmic purpose. The Sumerian version is blunt: you exist to dig ditches. This is not flattering. It does not elevate humanity. It presents us as biological tools, created for function, valued for productivity. It is a remarkably pragmatic creation narrative, lacking the poetry and grandeur of other traditions. Why would the Sumerians invent such a narrative unless they believed it was true? The labour categories specified, canal digging, mining, building, are precisely the labour categories that enabled Mesopotamian civilization to function. Without canals, no agriculture. Without mining, no metal tools. Without building, no cities or temples. These three types of work are the foundation of everything else. If you were designing a worker species to enable civilization, these are the exact capabilities you would need to incorporate. Sufficient intelligence to understand complex instructions, sufficient physical strength and endurance to perform heavy labour continuously, sufficient social coordination to work in large groups on extended projects, sufficient longevity to gain skill, but not so much that population becomes unmanageable. Humans possess all these traits. We can work together in large groups. We can perform sustained physical labour. We can learn complex tasks. We can coordinate our efforts toward long-term goals. We are social, trainable, productive. We are, in other words, exactly what you would design if you needed a labour force to dig canals, mine resources, and build cities. The texts describe us as having these capabilities not accidentally, but by design. We were made to do this work. Our traits were selected for this purpose. Our capacities match the tasks required because the tasks defined the design. Modern industrial civilization still depends on human labour. Though machines augment our efforts, we still dig, mine and build. We still organise in large groups. We still perform repetitive tasks for extended periods. The scale has increased and the methods have changed, but the fundamental nature of human work remains what the Sumerian texts describe: physical effort applied to transform the environment according to design. If the Anunnaki created us, they created us well. We perform the functions required. We have continued performing them for thousands of years. The design proved robust, adaptable, successful. We are still, in the 21st century, doing what the tablets say we were created to do. We still bear the workload. We still dig the earth. We still build the structures. We still extract the resources. Whether this is because we were designed for it, or because mythology reflected what we naturally do, the correlation is exact. The texts describe humanity's purpose, and that purpose matches what humanity actually spends most of its existence doing. We work, because that is what we were made for. The tablets say so. Our history confirms it. Our lives demonstrate it. The question is whether this is cosmic coincidence or documented truth. The medical texts. Among the thousands of cuneiform tablets excavated from Mesopotamian sites, several hundred contain medical information. These tablets catalogue diseases, describe symptoms, prescribe treatments, record surgical procedures, and document pharmacological preparations. They come from sites across Mesopotamia and span over 2,000 years, from the early 2nd millennium BC through the 1st millennium BC. What is remarkable about these texts is their sophistication. The oldest known medical handbook is a Sumerian tablet from Nippur, dated to approximately 2000 BC, now in the University of Pennsylvania Museum. This tablet contains 15 medical prescriptions, each specifying ingredients, proportions, preparation methods, and application instructions. The ingredients include plant materials, mineral substances, and animal products, combined in specific ways to treat specific conditions. One prescription describes treating a wound by grinding together turtle shell, salt, and mustard seed, mixing with beer, and applying the paste to the affected area. Another describes making an ointment from oil, cedar resin, and powdered limestone. These are not folk remedies randomly applied. They are standardized procedures, written down so they can be replicated. Later Babylonian and Assyrian medical texts expand on this foundation. The most extensive collections come from the library of Ashurbanipal in Nineveh, dating to the 7th century BC. These tablets contain a systematic medical compendium organized by body part and symptom type. They describe diagnostic procedures, prognostic indicators, and therapeutic interventions. The diagnostic texts are particularly sophisticated. They describe how to examine a patient, what questions to ask, what signs to look for, how to distinguish between similar conditions. The level of observational detail suggests long experience and systematic accumulation of medical knowledge. One diagnostic series, known as If the Patient, begins each entry with a conditional if the patient has fever and his eyes are yellow, followed by diagnosis and treatment. The format is rigidly structured, allowing physicians to match observed symptoms to documented conditions and implement standardized treatment protocols. Surgical procedures are also documented. Tablets describe lancing abscesses, setting broken bones, treating eye diseases, removing bladder stones. Bronze surgical instruments excavated from Mesopotamian sites match the descriptions in the texts, indicating that these were practical procedures actually performed, not theoretical medicine. Pharmacology was extensive. Mesopotamian physicians used hundreds of plant, animal, and mineral substances to create medicines. Texts specified dosages, timing of administration, dietary restrictions during treatment. Some preparations are described as poisons in high doses, but medicines in low doses, demonstrating understanding of dose-response relationships. Where did this knowledge come from? Mainstream medical history treats Mesopotamian medicine as the product of long empirical observation. People noticed that certain plants relieved certain symptoms. Over generations, they refined which plants worked best, in what preparations, for which conditions. This knowledge accumulated and was eventually systematized and written down. This explanation is reasonable and aligns with how folk medicine develops in proliterate societies. Trial and error over extended periods produces effective remedies, which are then transmitted orally and eventually recorded. But the sophistication of the earliest medical texts suggests something more than folk wisdom. The Nippur medical tablet from 2000 BC is already systematic. It uses technical vocabulary. It specifies precise procedures. It is written medicine, implying trained practitioners working from standardized texts rather than oral tradition being newly recorded. The Sumerian texts themselves attribute medical knowledge to the gods. Ninhursag, later called Gula, is the goddess of healing. She is patroness of physicians, called as in Akkadian. Hymns describe her as possessing knowledge of all diseases and all cures. Human physicians are her servants, implementing her knowledge. Enki is also credited with medical knowledge, as he is credited with all forms of practical wisdom. Incantations invoke Enki as source of healing power. One text describes Enki teaching the secrets of medicine to humanity, revealing which plants heal, which stones protect, which incantations cure. If we take these attributions seriously, even as thought experiment, Mesopotamian medical knowledge might not be entirely empirical accumulation. It might include taught knowledge, information transmitted from the Anunnaki to selected humans. If the Anunnaki created humans through genetic engineering, they would possess profound understanding of human biology. They would know which substances affect which systems. They would understand anatomy, physiology, disease processes. They could teach human physicians how to diagnose and treat conditions, not through trial and error, but through direct instruction based on their own comprehensive knowledge. This would explain why sophisticated medical texts appear early in Mesopotamian history rather than after long developmental periods. The knowledge was transmitted, not discovered. Human physicians learned from those who designed the human body. Certain aspects of Mesopotamian medicine are difficult to explain through pure empiricism. The use of mercury compounds in some prescriptions, for instance, is dangerous. Mercury is highly toxic. Discovering safe therapeutic applications would require extraordinary precision and many fatal errors. Yet Mesopotamian texts describe mercury preparations as standard treatments, suggesting knowledge of how to use dangerous substances safely without the trial and error process that would kill many patients. Similarly, some surgical procedures described in the texts are complex and risky. Cataract surgery is mentioned in the Code of Hammurabi, with penalties specified if the surgeon blinds the patient. But for surgeons to attempt such delicate procedures, they must have had detailed anatomical knowledge and confidence in their techniques. Where did they gain this knowledge? Standard explanation: from performing surgeries, observing results, refining techniques. But early surgeries would have high failure rates. The learning curve would be steep and deadly, unless someone taught the procedures, providing anatomical knowledge and technical instruction that reduced the failure rate from the beginning. Adapa, Enki's enhanced human, is described as a sage who possessed medical knowledge. He is listed among the Apkallu, the 7 sages who taught civilization to humanity before the flood. Medical knowledge is explicitly attributed to these pre-flood sages, suggesting that it was taught rather than discovered. If Mesopotamian medicine includes a taught component, a core body of knowledge transmitted from the Anunnaki rather than empirically derived, this would explain both its early sophistication and its attribution to divine sources. The Mesopotamians credited the gods with medical knowledge because the gods provided it. This interpretation challenges the standard historiography of medicine, which treats all ancient medical systems as empirical developments, gradual accumulations of practical knowledge refined over generations. It suggests instead that some ancient medical knowledge might represent transmission from more advanced sources. Whether those sources were gods, advanced humans, or something else, the texts are clear. The Mesopotamians believed their medical knowledge came from the Anunnaki. They treated it as revealed knowledge, taught knowledge, knowledge that originated outside human experience. If humans were designed by the Anunnaki, the designers would understand the design completely. They could teach repair techniques, maintenance procedures, how to diagnose malfunctions and implement corrections. Human physicians would be technicians, trained to work on organisms whose design they did not invent, but whose maintenance protocols they had been taught. This is precisely how Mesopotamian medical texts present the physician as servant of the healing goddess, implementing knowledge she possesses, following procedures she taught. The physician does not invent treatments, he applies what the goddess knows. Modern medicine operates similarly. Physicians learn anatomy, physiology, pharmacology from established bodies of knowledge. They apply techniques developed by predecessors. They follow protocols validated by research. They are technicians maintaining and repairing organisms designed by evolutionary processes they study but did not direct. If evolution is replaced with intentional design, the technician role remains the same. The physician works on a designed system, using knowledge of how that system functions, applying techniques for repair when malfunction occurs. The Mesopotamian medical texts, attributed to divine teaching, might preserve exactly this relationship. The Anunnaki designed humans. They taught selected humans how the design works and how to repair it. Those humans became the first physicians, and they recorded the taught knowledge in cuneiform tablets that survive to this day. Whether we accept this interpretation or prefer the standard empirical explanation, the sophistication of Mesopotamian medicine remains striking. These were not primitive people applying crude folk remedies. They were skilled practitioners using systematic procedures based on detailed anatomical and pharmacological knowledge. And they credited that knowledge to the Anunnaki, the beings who created humanity and who understood the human body because they designed it. What mainstream scholars say. Before proceeding further, we must fairly represent the academic consensus on these texts. Mainstream scholarship does not interpret the Sumerian creation narratives as historical documentation of genetic engineering. To suggest otherwise would be dishonest. The standard academic interpretation treats these texts as mythology in the technical sense, sacred narratives that explain origins, establish cosmic order, and provide theological foundation for religious practice. Scholars read them as expressions of Mesopotamian religious worldview, not as factual accounts of biological processes. Samuel Noah Kramer, one of the 20th century's preeminent Sumerologists, translated many of these creation texts. In his work Sumerian Mythology and the Sumerians, Kramer presents the texts as theological literature reflecting Mesopotamian beliefs about divine hierarchy, human purpose, and cosmic structure. He treats the Anunnaki as gods in the conventional religious sense, supernatural beings who exist in mythology but not in historical reality. Thorkild Jacobson, another leading scholar of Mesopotamian religion, interpreted Sumerian myths as expressions of the Mesopotamian experience of natural and social forces. In The Treasures of Darkness, Jacobson argues that gods represent personified aspects of reality. Enlil is the storm, Enki is the productive waters, Inanna is the power of love and war. Human creation myths, in this framework, explain humanity's place in the natural order and our relationship to the divine powers governing existence. W.G. Lambert, who published extensively on Babylonian creation myths, including major translations of Atra-Hasis and Enuma Elish, treated these texts as theological documents addressing perennial religious questions. Why do humans exist? Why is life hard? Why do we die? The myths provide answers satisfying to Mesopotamian religious sensibility. We exist to serve the gods. Life is hard because we must work. We die because the gods created us mortal. Jean Botreau, in Religion in Ancient Mesopotamia, emphasizes the functional nature of Mesopotamian religion. The gods are understood as powerful beings who must be served through ritual and offering. Human creation as labor force makes theological sense in this system. The relationship between humans and gods is transactional, based on service and reciprocal protection. Jeremy Black and Anthony Green, in Gods, Demons and Symbols of Ancient Mesopotamia, provide comprehensive documentation of Mesopotamian deities, including the Anunnaki, whom they describe as the great gods who determine destiny. They are divine beings within a polytheistic religious system, not historical entities or ancient astronauts. The academic consensus is overwhelming. These texts are mythology created by ancient peoples to understand their world, explain their existence, and establish religious frameworks for their societies. The texts are valuable as cultural artifacts, as windows into ancient worldviews, as literature of extraordinary age and significance. But they are not history. They are not documentation of genetic engineering. They describe gods, not advanced beings. They preserve beliefs, not events. This interpretation is not adopted because scholars are closed-minded or unwilling to consider alternative possibilities. It is adopted because it fits the texts into established scholarly frameworks for understanding ancient religion, because it aligns with our knowledge of human evolution and civilization development, and because it requires no extraordinary claims about ancient genetic engineering or extraterrestrial intervention. The texts describe impossible events, gods who live forever, who possess supernatural powers, who create humans from clay and blood through magical procedures. Nothing in our scientific understanding of biology supports the possibility of mixing blood with clay and producing living organisms. Nothing in our archaeological or paleontological evidence suggests humans appeared suddenly through artificial creation rather than evolving gradually from earlier hominids. Reading these texts as historical documentation requires abandoning established scientific understanding of human origins. It requires proposing that beings we have no physical evidence for, the Anunnaki as literal entities rather than mythological constructs, performed biological engineering we have no archaeological evidence for, producing results that contradict our genetic and fossil evidence for human evolution. Scholars are right to reject this interpretation. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and ancient texts alone, no matter how detailed or consistent, do not constitute such evidence. Myths are myths. Gods are mythological constructs. Humans evolved through natural selection over millions of years from earlier primate ancestors. This is the correct scholarly position based on available evidence. However, scholarly consensus has been wrong before. For centuries, scholars dismissed the historical existence of Troy because Homer's Iliad was mythology. Then Heinrich Schliemann excavated Troy in the 1870s, and mythology became archaeology. For decades, scholars dismissed the historical existence of the Hittite Empire, treating references in Egyptian texts as exaggerations. Then archaeologists excavated Hattusa in the early 20th century, and the Hittites were confirmed as a major ancient power. The Bible's references to the Assyrian Empire were once considered mythological exaggeration. Then excavations at Nineveh, Nimrud, and Khorsabad recovered the empire's vast archives, and biblical archaeology became a field. King Sargon of Assyria, mentioned in Isaiah but unknown to modern scholars, was rediscovered through cuneiform tablets in the 1840s. Mythology often preserves historical cause. Events that actually occurred become mythologized over time, acquiring divine actors and supernatural elements, but retaining geographic, chronological and factual details that point back to real history. The flood narratives found throughout Mesopotamian literature were once considered pure myth. Then geological and archaeological evidence confirmed that massive flooding occurred in Mesopotamia in the early 4th millennium BC. The myths preserve memory of actual events, though they attribute divine causation to natural disasters. This does not mean every mythological claim has a historical core. Many myths are pure invention, theological speculation, imaginative storytelling, but some myths preserve memory of real events, and distinguishing between pure invention and mythologized history is a valid scholarly endeavour. The creation narratives we have examined present unusual features for pure mythology. They maintain consistent procedural detail across multiple independent texts spanning over 1,000 years. They describe creation using technical, non-poetic language similar to that used for actual procedures in medical and administrative texts. They emphasize humanity's purpose as labour rather than worship or cosmic balance, which is pragmatic rather than theologically flattering. They describe experimental failures and iterative design, which is unusual for omnipotent divine creation. They attribute specific knowledge, especially medical and technical knowledge, to divine teaching rather than human discovery. They come from a civilization that documented everything else with obsessive factual precision. These features do not prove the texts document genetic engineering, but they do suggest the texts might preserve memory of something more than pure theological speculation. Academic skepticism is appropriate. These texts describe impossible events using impossible mechanisms. But if the events were possible, if advanced beings did create or modify humans, how would Bronze Age scribes describe it? They would use available vocabulary. They would call the beings gods. They would describe genetic material as blood and flesh. They would describe the process in terms they understood: mixing, shaping, gestating, birthing. The result would be texts that look exactly like what we have, procedural descriptions of biological creation attributed to divine beings, preserved with unusual consistency across centuries, maintained despite their uncomfortable implications about human status. Mainstream scholarship is correct to treat these texts as mythology given available evidence, but the texts themselves resist easy categorization. They are not clearly allegorical, they are not obviously symbolic. They present themselves as sequential historical narratives using documentary language. The question is not whether mainstream scholars are wrong. Within their evidential and methodological frameworks, they are right. Mythology is the appropriate category for these texts, given what we know about human origins and ancient belief systems. The question is whether the evidential framework might be incomplete, whether human origins might be more complex than purely natural evolution, whether ancient advanced civilizations or interventions might have occurred without leaving archaeological traces we have yet discovered, whether texts consistent across millennia might preserve actual memory rather than purely imaginative construction. These are not questions mainstream scholarship currently entertains as viable, but they are questions the tablets themselves raise, and dismissing those questions requires explaining why the Sumerians described human creation with such procedural precision, such consistency, such pragmatic purposes. Perhaps they were constructing mythology with extraordinary attention to detail for reasons we do not understand. Or perhaps they were documenting what they believed had actually occurred, using the only vocabulary available to describe events beyond their full comprehension. Scholarship has not settled this question because scholarship dismisses the question as unanswerable or improper. But the tablets remain. The texts say what they say, and what they say is that humanity was created by the Anunnaki through mixing divine blood with earthly clay, for the purpose of performing labour the gods no longer wish to do. Either this is mythology reflecting social organisation, or it is historical memory distorted by time. Academic consensus favours the former. The texts themselves seem to claim the latter. The patterns across tablets. When multiple independent sources tell the same story using the same details, historians take notice. Corroboration from separate witnesses strengthens a claim's credibility. This is basic methodology in historical research. Singular sources might be mistaken, biased, or fabricated, but when multiple sources confirm the same facts, we approach reliable documentation. The Sumerian creation narrative appears across multiple tablets from different cities, different time periods, different scribal traditions. Let us map this consistency. The Eridu Genesis CBS 10673, Penn Museum Car 1600 BC, copied from earlier Sumerian sources, describes creation of humanity, establishment of kingship in 5 antediluvian cities, and the coming of flood. Though fragmentary, it establishes human creation as divine project occurring in Eridu under Enki's direction. The Barton Cylinder CBS 8383, Penn Museum Car 2500 Bchg, among the oldest Sumerian religious texts, describes creation of humans and establishment of divine order. Though heavily damaged, recognizable elements include divine creation of humanity and assignment of human social roles. Atra-Hasis epic, multiple tablets, most complete on BM 78941, British Museum, Old Babylonian period car. 1700 BCE, most detailed account of Igigi rebellion, divine council, decision to create humans, procedural description using blood and clay, emergence of 7 males and 7 females, assignment of labour to humanity. Enki and Ninhursag, multiple sources compiled in Itsisi-Esel, various dates from Old Babylonian to Neo-Assyrian, describes creation competition between Enki and Ninhursag, production of defective beings, eventual success in creating functional humans, emphasises skill and procedure rather than spontaneous divine will. Ka-4 Middle-Babylonian, Ka, 1500,000 Batei, bilingual Sumerian Akkadian text describing slaughter of God, use of blood mixed with clay, creation of mankind, imposition of service, freeing of gods from labour, remarkably condensed but contains all key elements. Enuma Elish 7 tablets, most complete versions from Library of Ashurbanipal Ka. 700 Bagar, Babylonian creation epic describing creation of cosmos by Marduk, followed by creation of humans from blood of slain god Chingu to serve the gods. Same formula, god killed, blood used, humanity created for service. Adapa legend from Tel El Amarna and Nineveh, Ka. 1400-650 Bagar describes Adapa as special creation of Enki, given exceptional wisdom, but deliberately denied immortality. Demonstrates selective trait engineering. Sumerian king list, most complete on Weld Blundell Prism AN Nunnin 23 444, various dates from early dynastic through Old Babylonian, begins with after kingship descended from heaven, lists antediluvian kings with impossible reign lengths, treats pre-flood rulers as historical sequence, assumes human civilization originated from divine Bestial. These texts span nearly 2,000 years, from approximately 2500 BC to 650 BC. They come from different cities: Eridu, Nippur, Sippar, Babylon, Nineveh. They were written by different scribal schools, serving different temple complexes and political powers. They include both Sumerian and Akkadian languages, yet they tell the same story. The core elements remain consistent: divine labour crisis, gods or lesser gods performing heavy work, becoming exhausted, council decision, senior deities meet to address the problem and decide to create humans as solution. Blood and clay formula, divine essence, mixed with earthly material to produce new beings. Shaping and gestation, material is shaped into forms, undergoes developmental period, results in living humans. Multiplicity, 7 males and 7 females specifically mentioned in some texts, multiple humans in all texts. Labour assignment, humans immediately assigned to perform work previously done by gods, canal digging, cultivation, construction. Divine freedom, gods freed from burdensome labour, able to rest while humans work. This 7-element structure repeats, not just thematically but procedurally. The text describes the same sequence of events using similar terminology. Variation exists, of course. Enuma Elish emphasises Marduk's role and uses creation of humanity to demonstrate his supremacy over older gods. Enki and Ninhursag emphasises skill and competition. Atra-Hasis emphasises the rebellion and labour crisis. But beneath the variations, the same fundamental narrative appears. If these texts were independent mythological inventions, we would expect more variation. Different cities would emphasise different gods. Different periods would introduce new elements or drop old ones. Later texts would elaborate and embellish until the core narrative became unrecognisable. Instead, the core narrative remains stable. Later texts simplify or expand, but do not fundamentally alter the sequence. The formula, blood and clay, mixing and shaping, labour and service, persists. Comparative mythology shows how myths typically evolve. The Greek creation story varies substantially across sources. Hesiod's Theogony presents one version, Orphic traditions present another, regional variants add local deities and heroes. By the time Roman authors like Ovid retell Greek creation myths, they have been transformed almost beyond recognition. The Mesopotamian creation narrative does not follow this pattern. It remains remarkably stable across time and geography. This stability suggests either extraordinary cultural conservatism or preservation of a narrative considered historically important rather than mythologically flexible. We can also examine what the texts do not say. They do not describe gradual evolution. They do not describe spontaneous generation from the earth. They do not describe emanation from divine substance. They describe deliberate construction using specific materials following specific procedures. This is not how myths usually describe creation. Most mythological creation is spontaneous. A god speaks and reality appears, or a god transforms into the world, or the world emerges from chaos. Procedural creation, gathering materials, mixing components, following steps, producing results, is unusual in mythological contexts, but it is standard in technical documentation. Medical texts describe procedures this way. Architectural texts describe construction this way. Mathematical texts describe calculations this way. The Mesopotamians used procedural language when documenting practical activities. They used the same procedural language when describing human creation. Cross-cultural comparison is also revealing. Many cultures have creation myths. Most differ substantially from the Mesopotamian account. The Hebrew Genesis describes divine breath into dust, immediate animation, no procedural steps, no explicit purpose as labour force. The Egyptian Heliopolitan creation involves emanation from the primordial mound, spontaneous generation from the god Atum. The Hindu Rig Veda describes cosmic sacrifice of Purusha, whose body parts become elements of creation. The Chinese creation involves Pangu separating heaven and earth. These are diverse, imaginative, varied accounts reflecting different theological frameworks. The Mesopotamian account is narrow, specific and pragmatic, mix blood with clay, shape the mixture, produce workers. If all creation myths are equally mythological, why is the Mesopotamian version so consistent across time and so procedurally specific? The pattern across tablets suggests either that Mesopotamian scribal tradition was extraordinarily conservative, preserving narrative details with minimal change for 2 millennia, or that the narrative being preserved was considered factually important rather than theologically flexible. Scribal tradition was indeed conservative. Mesopotamian apprentice scribes copied ancient texts as training exercises. Standard texts were preserved with minimal alteration. But this conservatism applied to valuable cultural knowledge, mathematical tables, astronomical observations, legal precedents, medical procedures, information that needed to remain accurate. If human creation narratives received the same conservative treatment, perhaps because they were considered historical documentation, this would explain the stability. The tablets preserve a core account maintained across centuries because getting the details wrong would mean losing the historical truth. This interpretation is not academically mainstream, but the pattern is observable. Multiple independent sources spanning 2,000 years telling the same story with the same procedural details, using documentary language similar to that employed for factual rather than mythological content. The tablets corroborate each other. They provide independent attestation to the same sequence of events. By the normal standards of historical methodology, this should increase our confidence in the narrative's factual basis. The reason it does not is that the narrative describes impossible events, genetic engineering by gods. Scholars rightly conclude that if the event is impossible, then multiple attestations reflect shared mythology rather than shared history. But if the event were possible, if beings existed who could perform genetic engineering and did create humans, then multiple attestations across millennia from different cities and different scribal traditions would be exactly what we would expect. The historical record would preserve the account in multiple copies, maintained across time because the information was considered important. The pattern across tablets does not prove genetic engineering occurred, but it does demonstrate that the Sumerians and their successors treated this narrative as foundational truth, not as flexible myth. They preserved it consistently, attested it multiply, and transmitted it across cultural boundaries. Something about this narrative was important enough to maintain unchanged for 2,000 years. Either it was theologically essential or it was historically accurate. The tablets suggest the Sumerians believed the latter. The question that remains: in the controlled silence of museum archives, in climate-managed chambers beneath London and Philadelphia and Oxford, clay tablets rest in archival boxes. They are catalogued, photographed, translated, published. They are available for anyone to study. The evidence is not hidden. The texts are not secret. Everything discussed in this investigation exists in the scholarly record. Yet the questions persist. Did the Anunnaki exist as something other than mythological constructs? Did beings with advanced knowledge and capabilities interact with early humans? Did they modify us, enhance us, design us for purposes that shaped everything we became? The tablets claim they did, not tentatively, not symbolically. They describe it as historical fact, as events that occurred in real time and space, as the reason humanity exists. Mainstream scholarship rejects this claim, and with good reason. We have no archaeological evidence of ancient advanced civilizations possessing genetic engineering capabilities. We have no physical remains of the Anunnaki themselves. We have no technological artifacts demonstrating biological manipulation at that level. We have evolutionary evidence placing human origins in gradual development from earlier hominids, not sudden creation by external intelligence. The scientific framework does not support the literal reading of these texts. They describe impossible events using impossible methods attributed to beings for whom we have no evidence beyond textual references. So we call them myths. We study them as religious literature. We analyse their theology, their social function, their literary structure. We learn from them about Mesopotamian worldview, about ancient religious belief, about the cultural context that produced these narratives. And yet, the texts do not read like mythology. They read like documentation. They maintain procedural consistency across multiple sources. They describe design iterations and experimental failures. They specify materials and methods. They state explicit purposes rather than cosmic abstractions. If someone were trying to preserve memory of genetic engineering using Bronze Age vocabulary, the resulting texts would look remarkably similar to what we actually have. Divine beings become gods. Genetic material becomes blood and flesh. The process becomes mixing and shaping. The result is living humans designed for specific functions. The translation from technological to theological language would be inevitable. Ancient peoples lacking concepts of genetics, dinar, bioengineering would necessarily describe such processes in divine terms. The beings performing these acts would be called gods, because what else would you call beings with such power? But underneath the theological language, the procedural structure remains. The narrative stays consistent. The details persist. This does not prove the Anunnaki were real, or that human creation involved genetic manipulation. It suggests only that the texts might preserve something more than pure invention. Some core of events, however distorted by time and mythological elaboration, might underlie these narratives, or they might be entirely mythological, imaginative constructs with no historical basis, created to explain human existence within Mesopotamian theological frameworks. The evidence does not compel either conclusion. It allows both. We can read these texts as pure mythology, and that reading is defensible and scholarly, or we can read them as distorted historical memory, and that reading, while unorthodox, accounts for details the mythological reading struggles to explain. What we cannot do is ignore what the texts actually say. They say we were created by the Anunnaki. They say we were designed for labour. They say this was done using biological procedures involving divine and earthly materials. They say it occurred at a specific time in response to a specific problem. whether we believe it is separate from whether we acknowledge it. The tablets make this claim. Thousands of tablets across millennia from multiple cities in multiple languages using consistent procedural terminology. The Sumerians believed it, or they preserved a tradition claiming it, or they encoded something in this narrative that we have not yet learned to decode. In Mesopotamia 5,000 years ago, cities rose from the desert, canals brought water to fields, ziggurats climbed toward heaven, writing preserved knowledge, law organized society, humans built civilization using intelligence, cooperation, physical labor. We are still doing it, still building, still digging, still organizing our efforts toward collective goals, still using the same fundamental capacities that enabled the first cities. The tablets claim we were designed for exactly this, that our capabilities match our function because our function defined our design, that we are still performing the tasks we were created to perform. If this is true, it means humanity is not an accident of evolution, but a designed organism. It means our history has been guided, or at least initiated, by intervention from beings more advanced than ourselves. It means the timeline of human development might be shorter and more directed than evolutionary theory suggests. If it is false, it means the Sumerians created the world's most detailed and consistent origin mythology, maintained it with documentary precision across 2,000 years, and described it using procedural language for reasons we do not fully understand. Either possibility is extraordinary. Either humanity is a designed species created by advanced beings, or the Sumerians invented detailed genetic engineering narratives millennia before humans understood genetics. The question is which impossibility is less impossible. This investigation cannot answer that question. The evidence is ambiguous. The texts describe events that science says cannot have occurred using methods that were impossible at the time. Yet the texts describe these events with specificity and consistency unusual for pure mythology. You must decide what you believe. You have heard the evidence. You have seen what the tablets actually say. You understand the mainstream interpretation and the alternative readings. If you choose to believe the texts are mythology, you are in agreement with scholarly consensus. This is the safe, reasonable, defensible position. If you choose to believe the texts preserve historical memory of humanity's creation through genetic engineering by beings called the Anunnaki, you are proposing a revision of human history unsupported by current archaeological or paleontological evidence. Both positions acknowledge the same facts. The tablets exist. They say what they say. They were preserved across millennia by civilizations that documented everything else with obsessive accuracy. The interpretation of those facts is where we divide. Perhaps someday we will find archaeological evidence that clarifies this question. Perhaps genetic studies will reveal anomalies in human Na suggesting artificial manipulation. Perhaps we will discover technological artifacts from an earlier advanced civilization. Perhaps we will contact beings who can confirm or deny the Anunnaki narrative. Until then, we have the tablets, clay impressed with wedges, baked hard, surviving thousands of years. They carry a message across time. They claim to document our origins. Whether that message is history or mythology, truth or invention, memory or imagination remains, after all this investigation, unanswered. But the question is asked. The tablets asked it first. And the question, once encountered, is difficult to dismiss. In the darkness of your room, as you drift towards sleep, consider this. Everything you accomplish through work, everything you build or create or modify through labour, you do using capacities that first emerged in Mesopotamia when humans began building cities and civilization. Those capacities enabled everything that followed. Art, science, technology, culture, all built on the foundation of organised human labour applied to transform the world. The tablets claim We were given these capacities deliberately, that we were designed to possess them, that our existence serves purposes we may not fully understand. You can dismiss this as ancient mythology, the product of minds seeking divine explanations for natural phenomena, and you would have scholarly consensus supporting that dismissal. Or you can consider the possibility that somewhere in these ancient texts, preserved with extraordinary care across extraordinary time, lies a truth we have not yet been ready to accept. That we were made, that we are designed, that our creators, whoever or whatever they were, shaped us for purposes that defined what we became and what we still are. The tablets make this claim. History cannot yet confirm or deny it. The question remains open. The mystery endures. And in museum archives around the world, the evidence waits in clay, silent and patient, for the day when humanity is finally ready to understand what our oldest texts have been telling us since the beginning. We were created, we were designed, we exist for a purpose, whether we believe it or not.